Hello, and welcome to Saving People, Queering Things, a supernatural podcast. We were previously known as Driver Picks the Podcast, and the episode you're about to listen to was recorded under that name. Though our name has changed as of season 3, our show hasn't changed that much. Our structure and theme-based discussions are the same, and we're so glad you're here. Now, let's get on the road. Hello, and welcome to Driver Picks the Podcast, the show where we talk about ghosts, road trips, and free will through every episode of the TV series Supernatural. Today, we are discussing Season 1, Episode 4, Phantom Traveler, through the theme of priority. I'm Abigail, your host, and unlike Dean, I am not afraid of planes. Joining me today is Claire, who is an English teacher and is going to bring some of their theory expertise and pop culture analysis to our discussion of this episode. I'm so excited. Welcome, Claire.
That's me. Hello.
So on this week's Road So Far, our little series recap, Mary Winchester is dead. John Winchester is missing, and their two sons, Sam and Dean, are on the road to find their dad and avenge both their mother and Sam's girlfriend, Jessica, who were both killed by an unknown supernatural being. John has left several mysterious clues about his location, and so Sam and Dean are on the road saving people and hunting things while they search for him, so far unsuccessfully. That is our little series recap. Now we're going to jump into what is our episode recap. So this is something we have shamelessly stolen from Harry Potter and the Sacred Text. We're each going to take a turn in 30 seconds recapping the important events of this episode. So there's a plane that crashed, and Sam and Dean are investigating why it crashed. There appears to be only a few survivors, and in doing research, they realize that this is likely a demon. So Sam and Dean take the plane to try and see if they can exorcise this demon. They end up successfully being able to exorcise it using a exorcism ritual that Sam researches, and they manage to stop this demon and send it back to hell. Got the basics.
That was good. That was a tight 30.
Yeah.
That was a next soundbite you've provided for the people.
There we go. Now it's your turn.
God, okay. Okay, I think I'm ready.
Okay. 3, 2, 1, go.
While on this hunt, Sam and Dean realize that this demon has sort of become hip with the times and is causing plane crashes and loves to cause plane crashes at exactly 40 minutes into the flight, but leaves no survivors. And so part of the plot of this is tracking down all of the survivors and trying to make sure that they save them from a second plane crash death. So I think that's the only thing you've missed.
Yeah, and that was your time.
That was it.
There you go. Awesome. Okay, we are now going to move into our theme discussion. So every week we choose a theme prior to watching the episode, and then we kind of talk about where we see it. We also, in this section, kind of get to talk about things we've seen in the episode in general, connections we're making back to previous episodes, that sort of thing. So our theme today is the theme of priority. So where do you see the theme? What would you like to start with? I'll let you jump right in.
So we're talking about priority, and that's really interesting because there's a lot of like prioritization going on in this episode with both like Sam and Dean's sort of understanding of like each other and hunting and what that means, but also just like with the hunt actually. They have to make a lot of decisions about, what they can and can't control, what they can and can't prioritize, who they can and can't save. And so I think that is the thing that I really sort of seized on when I was watching this episode with you, was this idea of like the fear of not being in control and not being able to sort of set the priorities of the mish or whatever. And I think, and I mentioned this, I've mentioned this briefly in talking to you, But I think that's something that's really interesting about Supernatural, is that it's like genre wise, it's sort of everything. And I think this week it really walked the line between like comedy and horror, right? Because sometimes you get a little bit of Western happening in there, you get a little bit of a road tale, um, and so this week we got a lot of the horror came from that inability to like be in control and to decide where the priorities lie. Um, Especially because at one point in the episode, one of the survivors, who is a pilot, um, that's like one of the two people that die in the episode is uh, this pilot who they're not able to get to in time to like realize that the survivors are being targeted.
They don't have a good clear indicator of what even the possibility of this monster is at that point.
Right. And that's so interesting too, because demons are so like part and parcel of what Supernatural is.
Yeah. And Dean says in
That,
this
like,
episode, he's like, this isn't our normal gig. Like it's really interesting when you think of the future lore of the show about the fact that at this point, demons are this like way far out thing. Like they know they exist, but they don't expect them to be obviously causing problems. And later on, we're going to start to see demons as like this just like very base level sort of like supernatural creature that's sort of all over the like, you know, they're just everywhere. There's just so many of them and they're always causing problems.
right.
It's really interesting. It makes me wonder within the show's lore if they're trying to set up that demons are generally actually a lot more subtle, like that usually you wouldn't be able to pick up on a demon's actions because usually, and I think they've mentioned this in the episode of like who knows how many other times this has happened where a plane has gone down and we haven't realized it was a demon. And I wonder if as Sam and Dean become more important in terms of like right now they're these kind of, we don't know a lot about their history and about their connections to the supernatural world at large, but as we know more of that and as they become more important to not only, you know, their own family story but also to like a bigger story, then they start to encounter more demons. And I wonder if that's sort of what they're setting up, like they're not.
Yeah, and I think sort of genre wise too, that like a lot of what we're seeing right now with like how they interact with monsters and stuff is very monster of the week kind of Buffy the Vampire Slayer format.
Mm-hmm.
So it would make sense that they're like, oh man, like a demon's a really big deal. Um and like that is actually I think a really interesting and effective scaling method, just in terms of like the mechanical writing of the show. Is demons at the start of the show, I mean, kind of need to be upsettingly difficult to deal with, um, in order for us to scale into like a more robust universe that where we see a lot more demons.
Yeah. And the whole season
Yeah,
at this point was, oh, sorry.
No,
Like
keep going.
they like the first 5 seasons were designed by Eric Kripke all together. So they are intentionally building. Like when we get past season 5, it starts to, the show running kind of changes a bit in some of the ways that they're writing. They're more season by season in terms of some of the story arcs. But in the first 5 seasons, it was planned out to be. So they know that they're building and they know where demons are kind of going in the lore. And so yeah, I think that's exactly what they're doing is they're starting out with them being very big and scary so that we actually get a sense of the scale of this world of like these guys have been hunting their whole lives pretty much and they've never actually encountered a demon yet.
Yeah. And like it's kind of like in a video game, like you have to have like a very early boss fight, that is like, you look back on it when you've played all 300 levels and you're like, oh geez, that was so easy. But as you're scaling up and like learning to play the video game, like that is a difficult boss fight.
Mm-hmm.
And so this, while we're only on episode 4, this to me counts as like a kind of mini boss fight for them, because
Oh,
it's
for
giving
sure.
you like a preview taste of some of the controls that you need later in the game.
Yeah. And shows us them, they're successful, but at the same time, some of the reasons they're successful isn't because they're actually super great at knowing how to take care of demons. Like, it
Right.
gets real dicey in the middle there. And they manage to keep this plane from going down, but they don't manage to save everyone before that point. And there's a lot of moments where they're not sure if they're going to really get out of it. There's a bit of a somberness at the end of this episode of them recognizing kind of that if demons are now in play, this is, like the body count tends to be higher.
Yeah. And so I think that brings us kind of back to like that theme, right, of priority, of just like, God, okay, well, now that demons are in play, that sort of realigns, like, their priorities in terms of like suspicions about where Jonathan might be, right? And about like who might have killed Jess and who might have killed their mom and different things like that. Especially because the demon in this episode goes, "Hey, I know who killed your girlfriend," um, which has to, for Sam, sort of realign that understanding of like what's going on.
Yeah, which is really interesting. And this is something that's kind of come up in the last few episodes as well, with Sam's kind of character arc so far, is in terms of where was my thought going? About Sam's priority. So Sam's priority from episode 1 has been, in episode 1, it's to get back to his normal life. It's to find John and get back to his normal life at Stanford. As soon as Jess dies, his priority becomes find John so that we can find Jess's killer.
Yeah.
Like, that's been his whole priority. That's been they argue about it in Wendigo and in Dead in the Water, where Sam is like, why are we still hunting these random monsters? Why are we running all of these hunts when there is a bigger priority, which is that, like, Dad is still missing, we don't know who killed Jess. And this kind of, for the first part of this episode, Sam's really actually seems to be really okay with the fact that they're doing this sort of hunt that is unconnected to John, except that the person that they're helping is a friend of John's. But by the end, because of that interaction with the demon, Sam's kind of realigned with like that priority again. But there's a bit more of like some layering on it, because there's also, I think, he's got some experiences of the saving people element of this life, not just the like, we need to hunt down Jess's killer, but also like, we're actually saving people from these other monsters as we go along. And whereas like we've seen that contrasted with like Dean's priority, which is a lot more constant at this point, because Dean's priority is, his relationships with Sam and John and saving people. He doesn't really have a like priority he's trying to get back to, or he's not trying to, there's not a one mission he's trying to kind of accomplish. His mission is a lot simpler at this point in the show. And and then you get that tension between the two of them because of what they're individually prioritizing. They don't have the same priorities, and yet they are sort of, they're having to work together to figure out what to prioritize in an individual hunt.
Yeah, and I think, it's one of the things that we kind of thought about before we started recording, was this like dynamic between Dean and Sam, and the like the interesting kind of believer skeptic dichotomy they've got going on. but that has to be qualified as like it's not that Sam is skeptical of supernatural elements, which is typically the role of the skeptic.
And we're actually going to see Sam in some ways be more believing of supernatural elements that he hasn't seen. Like Sam is like, because I believe in because I've experienced the supernatural, really anything is possible. But yet he's still kind of painted and played as the skeptic character. Sorry, I want you to continue telling why that is.
No, you're perfect. Yeah, he's played as sort of the foil to like Dean's believer, but what they believe in and are skeptical of individually is not supernatural stuff. It's like the Winchester mythos and the Winchester vibe. And so like to see one of the things that you mentioned that I do actually want you to talk more about is like Dean in this episode is sort of really showcasing his like knowledge about stuff, and is really like fairly knowledgeable about demonology and different things like that. And Sam is like, oh shit. Like there's no actual moment where Sam's like, damn, you know a lot about this. But it's like clear that he's like, oh, my brother does kind of know a lot of things. So if you want to take that away, because I think that's really interesting.
Yeah, it was something I noticed because of two scenes in particular. So the first scene with the EMF reader, where Dean's sort of showing off this homemade out of a Walkman EMF, and Sam's reaction is kind of to like a little bit scoff at it. Not that it like he recognizes that it works, but he sort of laughs at Dean for having this homemade sort of EMF meter. And then the other one that I noted was when they're figuring out the location for that they need to go to, and it's Dean points out that it's like near Nazareth, and Dean points out that that's ironic, which is because of the biblical lore around Nazareth and resurrection and that sort of thing. But what I noticed in that is that, like, I think my suspicion is that when Sam and Dean were children hunting with John, is that Sam has sort of always been characterized by John, by other people in their lives, as sort of the smart one, as the one who likes books, the one who knows things, the one who studies really well. When we see flashbacks in later episodes of the show, we'll see that Sam has always been that way. And Dean is sort of presented, and I think maybe the way John has sort of characterized him and the way he's allowed himself to be characterized in the different places they've been in their childhood is as kind of the man's man, as the like mechanic, as the like I can fix cars and I can beat things up, but he's not necessarily been personified as like super intelligent. And I think in some ways they have both Sam and Dean have bought into this family lore about who they are. And this episode kind of challenges that because it showcases the fact that like Dean knows biblical lore, knows how to put together an EMF meter out of random shit that works, knows things about demons. We've seen that in a couple of the previous episodes as well, where he instantly has theories about monsters based on just little bits of information. And we're also going to see that Sam also has these intelligence pieces and the research pieces. We see that in this episode. But I think some of Sam's incredulity at Dean and some of his sort of like gape mouth, sort of like, oh, my brother's smart, is because of these sort of roles they've been in for a lot of their lives. And I think it's interesting. And the show will continue to kind of disrupt the idea that either of them is just one thing. And I think that was what I wanted to say about that. But yeah, I think that's a really interesting thing that happens in this episode. And it's also one of my pet peeves when people will kind of fall into that characterization of either of these characters where they go, oh yeah, Sam's good at research and Dean's good at beating things up. You're like, yes, but it's also like misses a lot of the clues that the show is giving us about both of their expertise in the hunting world.
Yeah, and I think that like really speaks to the conceptualization that we have of like what masculinity is.
Mm-hmm.
gonna readjust my position because I'm a nightmare. But like of what masculinity is and what it does, right? And so like there's this kind of dichotomy made between Sam and Dean, where like Sam is well read and like learned and like as you've talked about, but also has these interactions with Dean where he's like, hey man, you should like talk about your feelings, and Dean's like, stop doing that touchy feely shit. Like I think we had that moment in this episode, and so I think that's really interesting because while this show is both like trying to kind of undermine this conception of like masculinity as one thing, it is in the exact same breath reinforcing this kind of idea of masculinity as like logical, not emotional, um and it's not necessarily endorsing that, except that I think of the two brothers, I mean, I think that Dean is meant to be the protagonist. Like if I had to pick a protagonist out of the two of them, it is Dean.
Yeah. Yeah. And which is interesting because, especially in this first season, Sam is our point of view character as an entrance into the show, which is why this show is really hard to nail down a protagonist proper. Yeah. But in terms of like, yeah, I would agree with you that.
Yeah, which makes a couple like some later episode choices very interesting. Which is not what we're talking about now, but just the like idea of how masculinity is like working in this show and how this show is sort of working on masculinity and like constructing that.
And it's interesting because that's going to develop a ton over the course of 15 seasons, where we're going to get both a lot of reinforcement of a certain kind of masculinity, but we're also going to get a lot of storytelling and character development that's going to undermine that consistently, and that I think ultimately is going to land it as more of a critique and as more of a challenge in terms of both of these characters as well, because we're going to see them both have character arcs to do with emotions, to do with vulnerability, but also to do with, you know, not dealing with your emotions and anger and revenge. And you're going to get like yeah, and you almost get both of those from both of them at different times. Like you're almost going to get, I think, at most points in the show, you get one of them coded more in the typical masculine way in terms of the way they handle emotions, and you get one of them coded as more of like, not even necessarily feminine, but in terms of open to emotions, or, you know, usually one of them's trying to push the other one towards that, and they kind of give and take that at this point a ton. And at this point, we've definitely got more of Sam with like some like presented as if he has more emotional intelligence, though we're going to see that that's also a bit of a facade pretty fast, even in this episode where like Sam is not sleeping because he's having nightmares, and Dean tries to kind of probe at that, at like, you should be sleeping, and also like, you should maybe talk about this.
This is the thing I just keep talking about, like with genre, and I actually do think it fits our conversation about priority, because I think this show actually doesn't know what genre it wants to prioritize.
It doesn't, and it will continue to not know every season.
Like, is it a road trip show? Is it like a buddy cop show? Is it a, you know, like, is it kind of a comedy or a dark comedy, or is it horror?
Well, and even later on, is it like almost superhero? Is it sort of interpersonal, like is it a sort of family story? Is it a romantic story? Because we've got to consider that, even though I think that's one of the ways the show doesn't ever intend to do, but accidentally does, especially in a couple of the later seasons where we have these big romantic story arcs that are never explicitly labeled that. But I think especially in these seasons, the tension between like this Americana gothic horror and this sort of mystery, and then also like this kind of buddy cop, it doesn't know what it wants to be.
Like the shots of it's like, what do we prioritize, right? Because it's just like the shots of you know, like these great iconic horror shots of the like bones of the plane or whatever that has been crashed, which is like super creepy, super interesting. But then also the like, just the like shots of like Sam and Dean in their classic car coming around a U bend to the tune of some classic rock. Okay, it's like love to drive with my hyper masculine brother and his leather jacket in our dad's classic car, listening to our dad's favorite music
Yeah.
and talking about, you know, how we're gonna send these bastards back to hell. Like,
Yeah.
like one of the things that the show is prioritizing is this like idealized version of masculinity and this concept of like being able to be a man on the road just seeing people.
Hmm.
um
Which is also really interesting. I was thinking about this because I was watching an episode, a much later episode. I was watching an episode that I think is from season 11. And I was noting the fact, I've been watching a lot of later episodes recently. I was noting the fact that of how, like, proportionately, how often they wear suits
mhm.
versus like kind of street clothes. And this episode, Phantom Traveler, is the first time that they use Homeland Security for fake IDs. And it's also the first time they wear suits. And it's very clear from the way they kind of wrote the dialogue around that, that has not been a strategy they've utilized to get information. Dean's very uncomfortable with it. He makes a bunch of digs at it. He calls it a monkey suit, like, which I think is also another genre thing. Like they're trying to present them as these like rough and tumble
Yeah, like
Western heroes.
working class, yeah,
Yeah, and them wearing suits.
like the blue collar masculinity,
Yeah,
yeah.
it's blue collar masculinity, and it's interesting because the show is not going to be able to hold on to that because they use this as a strategy this time, the suit. And Dean even says, like, after they hop over the barbed wire fence and he's used the coat to kind of protect himself from the barbs, he's like, oh, they got, the monkey suits got some use.
Right.
But it's interesting because they're not going to be able to stick with that. And I think a lot later we're going to get a lot more of them being very comfortable, even as people and as characters. They're going to become very comfortable with switching their personas, with having many personas, as having the hyper masculine blue collar, having the guy in a suit, having the ladies man, having the man's man. Like they're going to kind of genre mash, like who these, we don't, the show doesn't even, not even necessarily that it doesn't know who it wants these characters to be, but that it wants these characters to be so many different things, which I think is part of what makes them really interesting, because they feel like real people who are also many different things.
Right.
You get the, like, in a lot of ways, both of these characters are kind of walking contradictions of the things they say they want. Because Sam, too, like, Sam says he wants to kind of be out of this life. Sam wants to prioritize a different kind of life. He doesn't really want to know any of this lore, but also he's incredibly good at picking up the lore, knowing what to do with it. And as soon as Dean, I wanted to note this because it's a thread we've been following through, is that as soon as, like, once they make the decision to go on the plane, and they've had the conversation about how Dean hates flying, Sam, the switch of like who is running the case, because they're almost always, especially in the earlier seasons, usually one of them is kind of running the case and the other one is playing a support role, and it goes back and forth. Earlier on it's Dean more often, but Sam takes very active charge of this particular hunt as soon as Dean is sort of freaked out by the plane and really anxious. And he, calms Dean. He's the one that, like, knows the exorcism. He is the one that, kind of strong arms Dean into, like, you got to chill out or else, like, you are wide open to demonic possession. And, like, Sam wants to pretend that he, like, has left this whole life behind and that, like, he's going to be a lawyer in a suit with a girlfriend,
Right.
pretending that monsters don't exist. But, like, the instant he's back in this world, he's actually incredibly capable of it. And
What is the concept too of like Sam was put into the like settle down, get a job, get a degree role, but never really wanted to do that, like always wanted to be his brother. And Dean is put into the role of like, I am the hunter, but never really wanted to do that and want to be his brother. Right, and so it's like got those tensions sort of crossing of like each of them is who the other wishes they were.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's really, really true, which is a really good point. And we're going to see that like later on in some of their arcs of like the way they both conceptualize home and family is quite different based on what they want and what they've experienced, even though they grew up in a very similar, like they grew up in the same environment. They have very different kind of goals and reasons they don't go after it. So like the reason that Sam goes to Stanford and leaves the life, and it's not really to do with hunting, it's to do with like the revenge mission, it's to do with John, it's to do with like him not having his own independence and being able to be his own person, which is so much of Sam's arc, is like I've got to be able to prioritize like being my own person. We talked in the very first episode about, we used the theme of promises, and one thing we talked about is how Sam has sort of made this promise to himself that he is going to like be his own person and that he is going to keep his promises to himself to get out and be independent and not be just a member of his family. And like Dean, on the other hand, like has not pursued the life that he would really want, maybe like a family life of settling down, because he also doesn't feel like he has an option of that. And his promise has always been to like, I am going to stick with my family, regardless of whether or not that means I can't have my dreams or can't have the things that I really want. Mm-hmm. But they're always constantly mad at each other for the fact that they're pursuing actually very similar things. They're both pursuing what they want, but what they want just constantly puts them at odds with each other.
The opposite thing.
Yeah. Is there anything else you wanted to say in this kind of section?
No, I don't think so. I think we got it.
I think we got it. So our next segment that we've been doing, we need a better name for it. Basically just our kind of our tracking section, our counters section. We're paying attention to some different patterns and themes and kind of specific events that happen in the show, and we are tracking them. How I've kind of been doing this is I kind of explain the counter, and if you want to give us an update on it, does that sound like that'll work for you?
Oh, that sounds good.
And then I can jump in with anything that we need. Right. So our first counter is significant character deaths. So any character that dies that's significant, regardless of how much they've shown up, or how much like what we see on screen or what we hear about. Currently, our characters at 2. We only have had 2 significant deaths, and that is Mary and Jess.
Right. Yeah. We didn't have any others this episode. This episode was relatively death-free for our intrepid heroes. That won't necessarily remain the case for a terribly long time, but at least for now.
Yeah, we've got a few more. We've got a little bit more time before we start getting into some more significant deaths. Especially, we've had a lot of one-off Monster of the Week episodes at this point.
Yeah,
other than the pilot.
Yeah, and that continues for quite a while. That's true.
Yeah, especially and when we were talking about genre earlier, the first 2 seasons, I would say specifically, the first 2 seasons have that Americana Gothic horror feeling in a way that has a pretty distinct like switch when you hit season 3 because of the plot that they're doing in season 3. There's still elements of it, but it stops being that as a genre generally. Our second counter is the Bechdel test. We're keeping track of how many times Supernatural passes the Bechdel test. The Bechdel test, for those of you who don't know, is a super low bar test to talk about how female characters are represented in pieces of media. To pass the Bechdel test, there have to be 2 named female characters. They have to have a conversation with each other about something that is not a man.
That's literally it. That's all they have to do. And you know what? They ain't passed it yet. And they still ain't passed it.
Yeah, I don't know what to say. We've said everything that can be said on that.
Woohoo!
Woohoo! So our third one, this one becomes a little more fun today. This is our lore check. So we called it our plot points check last episode, but I think it's better aptly named lore check. This is basically keeping track of things that we've now been told about the lore. Do they match up with what we've been told previously? What's the continuity looking like?
Yeah, I think I mean, obviously we kind of touched on the biggest thing is like this really gets us into the demon zone. Right. So we're seeing a lot of the demonic elements for the first time, such as like um holy water that hurts them, and the use of the word Christo to identify whether or not someone is a demon. Um, and also things like, a demon can be identified because their eyes do that thing where they turn black, and a person gets opened up for demonic possession when they're in a particularly vulnerable emotional state, such as fear, um, or stress, or things like that. Um, yeah, just different things that demons can be a sort of airborne, incorporeal problem, but they can also be a more incorporated problem, especially when they have human hosts.
Yeah, the only things I like had specifically thought about there that I think are interesting in terms of continuity is that we have a couple instances in this episode of demons entering a human through host through their eyes.
Yes.
Whereas later on in the show, we're almost exclusively going to get demons entering through the mouth, entering and exiting through the mouth. And it's a little, I get why they did, because it looks weird and doesn't quite work the same when it's through the eyes, the smoke. So that's a continuity thing. The other continuity thing there is obviously the use of Christo as a way of telling whether or not someone has been possessed, using the word Christo, because as Sam points out to Dean, that demons will flinch at the name of God. This is one of those continuity things that the show, it's not really a big spoiler to say that the show gave up on this immediately. It's done. So the use of Christo to tell whether someone is possessed happens in this episode and happens once in season 15. It's a really interesting use. Sorry, not 15, 14. It's a really interesting use in 14 because of the particular character that does it, which is an interesting one because he's also new to the supernatural world. And you assume he learned it from either Sam, Dean, or Cass. And he uses it, or he read it somewhere. He uses it once in one hunt. And it works. Like it, it doesn't work, but like, because it's not a demon, but he uses it. And like he does the whole like Christo cough thing. And it's really amusing, but you're like, when I saw it, I was like, we haven't used that since episode 4. Like, didn't know we were still saying that worked. Obviously, the only other like continuity world building thing is that we talked about this a little bit. This is the first time they use Homeland Security for fake IDs. And that's obviously them using higher and higher levels of federal authority to get access to information is going to be a pattern. But this is one of the earlier uses of that. Our fourth kind of thing we're keeping track of is actually locations. So I grew up in the Vancouver area where most of the show was filmed. My sister, who's one of the other hosts, obviously also grew up there. So we've just been kind of keeping track of locations that any of our hosts have been to or are familiar with. And this episode has 2 locations that I'm familiar with. One of them is YVR International Airport. Obviously, that's where they filmed the airport scenes. That's the Vancouver International Airport. And the second one is actually a road. In the show, when they drive down the road, there's a sign that says Nazareth, and they're driving towards Nazareth. That's actually the road towards Delta. I used to drive that for work almost every day, and so they've changed this, like the location of the sign is exactly where the sign that usually says Delta, I think it either says Delta or it says the ferry, because there's a ferry in Delta. And I've driven by it many times, and every time I see it, I'm like, oh, I recognize that road. It's a nice road to drive. Our last segment is going to be a short one today. It's actually a new segment that we'll be using now and again, and it's the Would We Survive This Monster segment. So we're just going to say, would we survive this monster? How would we survive this monster? Would you survive this monster, Claire?
No. Thank you. I would have been fully plane crashed, if you will.
This one's not a this monster appeared because, 20 years ago you killed a kid and now it's spirits haunting you. Like this one's like, we don't know why we're never even told. We have no idea why this demon attacked this plane. Other than like, we're kind of told that demons are just like destructive. So yeah, no, not surviving this one.
Fully would die. I don't think we'd summon it either.
Is there anything else you want to say in relation to this episode?
No, only that it bangs more than we thought it was gonna. So nice.
Agreed.
Love that for us.
Huge thank you to Claire for joining us today. And you're going to be on a couple episodes coming up, some other fun ones. So very excited for that. And thank you to any of our listeners. We wish you a peaceful and non-monstery road until the next time we meet you. A note to our listeners. This episode was recorded prior to our season 3 name change, where we went from Driver Picks the Podcast to Saving People, Queering Things. For all of our new social media platforms, visit queeringthingspodcast.com.